It's late summer in 1805, and the expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark is growing desperate. With the days already shortening and the frozen mountains barring their way loftier than any in their experience, the outlook is grim for the group of 45 souls. The snowy peaks of the Rockies guaranteed starvation and hypothermia to any travelers unfortunate enough to lose their way. But for one member of the expedition, each footstep westward brings her not farther into the wild, but closer to home. I'm Charity Mainwaring. Welcome to Strong Stories, where we talk about the lives of brave women who shaped history. In the spring of 1788, Sacagawea was born into a clan of northern Shoshone known as the Agaidika, the salmon-eaters. Her people roamed the narrow valleys and pine-clad ravines which straddled the Continental Divide. One season might find them hunting buffalo east of the mountains, and the next might see them fishing salmon amidst the Rockies' western foothills. The tribe's travels brought frequent contact with neighboring peoples, and not all the interactions were peaceful. The Shoshone still fought with bows and arrows, whereas many surrounding tribes had acquired guns from the whites, leaving the Shoshone vulnerable and anxious. When Sacagawea was 12, one of the neighboring tribes, the gun-wielding Hidatsa, launched a sudden and violent raid, killing a number of men, women, and boys, but kidnapping the young girls, including Sacagawea. Surrounded by captors who spoke a language strange to her and missing her parents and all she knew, Sacagawea was marched east over the Great Plains, 800 miles to a Mandan village friendly to the Hidatsa in present-day North Dakota. The origin of the name Sacagawea appears to be Hidatsa, not Shoshone, meaning bird woman in the language of her captors. If that is true, it means that she was not even allowed to retain her original Shoshone name, but was forced to go by a new name chosen for her by her kidnappers. The following year, at a tender 13 years old, she was sold as one of two wives to a French trapper, Toussaint Charbonneau. The Frenchman was over 20 years her senior, possibly more, and according to some sources, won the young teen from the Mandans in a gambling bet. Meanwhile, events a world away were to have a profound impact on Sacagawea's life. Napoleon Bonaparte, the infamous military and political leader of France, was short on cash and despairing of making his New World Empire profitable in light of the revolts and ongoing war with Britain. So he stunned his advisors by announcing plans to sell the entire 828,000 square mile Louisiana territory to the Americans for 3 cents an acre, the biggest land deal in history. A delighted President Jefferson leapt at the chance and soon had his personal assistant, Lewis, and Lewis's good friend Clark, named captains of an expedition to discover what exactly the United States had just purchased. By the time the explorers had journeyed up the Missouri River as far as Sacagawea's village and wintered there in 1804, the teenager was 6 months pregnant with her first child. Lewis and Clark knew that the river could only take them so far. They would need horses to cross the Continental Divide. In their travels, they had heard of the Shoshone, horse riders of the mountain foothills, and knew this tribe was exactly what they were looking for. It was, as you might expect, with particular interest that the two captains learned from the Mandans that a certain teenage girl of that village spoke fluent Shoshone. Her husband, Charbonneau, Lewis wrote, was a man of no particular merit, but Lewis and Clark hired him on the spot to come with them, knowing he would bring his young wife too. On February 11th, 1805, Sacagawea had been long in labor, and doubts grew that she would survive the delivery. Lewis records that one of his men searched through the animal specimens Lewis had been collecting until he found what he was looking for, which was the rattle of a rattlesnake, obviously, which would do the trick to get the baby out. But within 10 minutes of drinking the rattle crushed in water, Sacagawea gave birth to a baby boy, whom Charbonneau named Jean-Baptiste, and the Americans dubbed Little Pomp. The teenage girl was to come with the expedition over the Rockies with a nursing infant on her back. On the morning of April 7th, with the snows banished to the hilltops and the buffalo herds busy on the newly green prairie, the expedition set out upriver. Long before they reached the mountains, the young woman proved herself an invaluable member of the company, as she knew better than any of them which wild foods could be eaten and where to find them. Prairie turnips, artichokes, wild licorice, and berries began to grace the captain's dinner plates each evening. More importantly, the native peoples the explorers met along the riverside visibly relaxed and lost their suspicions of a trap by the white men when they took note of the young mother. as no war parties in their culture ever traveled with women. On May 14th, as Clark recorded, most unfortunately, Charbonneau had been entrusted with manning the tiller of his pirogue, a canoe with a sail and rudder, and the fur trader steered broadside into a squall of wind, overturning the boat. None of the men could swim, and Lewis and Clark watched in horror from the bank 300 yards away, while Charbonneau spluttered and cried out in fear, failing to right the sail, but instead descending into a splashing panic. "This accident nearly cost us dearly," Clark recorded that night, as this boat contained the expedition's papers, instruments, books, medicine, and almost every article indispensably necessary to ensure the success of the enterprise. Lewis recorded that he would rather have died than lost the contents of the boat. Of all people, it was Sacagawea, likely with her baby on her back or in her other arm, who swam out and gathered every item, including the two captains' priceless journals, saving the expedition from ruin and saving for history our knowledge of each day's events. All the journal entries of the young, able-bodied men making the trek westward that summer agree. The journey was exhausting. How a teenage girl made the trip under the scorching sun bearing her infant child it defies imagination. The group spent grueling weeks scrambling up the rocky foothills with their hands as often as their feet. And once a flash flood nearly drowned the young mother and her baby together in a gully. Storms rolled down from the Rockies and at times hurled hailstones the size of softballs, nearly killing one man. And to top it off, a nice-sized grizzly bear population brought several life-threatening encounters. And then for several days, Sacagawea fell gravely ill. Following the medical practices of the day, Lewis first leached her blood and then gave her doses of opium. Must have been fresh out of the rattlesnake drink they gave her earlier. If he'd been deliberately trying to prevent her recovery, he could hardly have done more. Yet, somehow, Sacagawea not only survived it all, but so impressed the captains that praise of the young woman began to show up in their daily diaries, especially for her bravery and fortitude. As August drew on and the days shortened, the captains knew that the autumn snows were only weeks away up on the mountain passes, but no clear route presented itself. And as they had not found the Shoshone, they still did not have the horses for crossing the menacing mountains ahead. Soon they would have to leave their boats and strike out over land. But without horses, the party was in danger of being snowed in by an autumn blizzard. The towering crags of the Bitterroot Rockies, crowned in everlasting snow, promised death for any who lingered in their shadows. "If we do not find the Shoshone," Lewis admitted to his journal, "I fear the successful issue of our voyage will be very doubtful." It was this lowest of moments for the expedition that Sacagawea began to recognize the land of her birth. "She assures us," Lewis recorded, "that we shall either find her people on this river or on the river immediately west, which cannot be very distant." Hope returned, and the party pressed on. Clark later wrote that the young woman had become the company's pilot as they negotiated their way through the mountain passes. A few days later, a band of 60 warriors on horseback rode into view, barring the path ahead. It was the Shoshone. The natives were curious and friendly, but became alarmed at the sight of the explorers' guns. When their chief, a powerful man named Kamiawate, advanced to speak with Clark, Sacagawea was called to interpret. She had just sat down and begun translating when suddenly she leapt back up and ran to the Shoshone chief, hugging him and sobbing. Kamiawate, she explained to the stunned white man, was her brother, the first family she had seen since her kidnapping. Tears of joy and more weeping threatened to engulf the negotiations in happiness. But a deal was struck. The travelers would have as many horses as they desired. Meanwhile, Sacagawea learned that her parents were dead. Just 2 brothers remained alive, one of whom was absent. 12 days later, not daring to tempt the worsening weather any longer, the company struck out on the hard trek through the Rockies. We have no record that Sacagawea ever saw her people again. The mountain passage proved even more challenging than any expected, and the group was starving by the time they emerged on the western side. Sacagawea showed them how to find camas bulbs, which provided much-needed sustenance as they picked a path out of the foothills. After many adventures boating west down the Columbia River, the expedition reached the Pacific Ocean at last on November 18, 1805. Before long, a blue whale carcass that had beached nearby drew much interest from the men. But when the scouting party tried to set out for it without her, the teenager raised an outcry. Lewis wrote, "She observed that she had traveled a long way with us to see the great waters, and that now that the monstrous fish was also to be seen, she thought it very hard she could not be permitted to see either." The captains relented and welcomed her on the venture. After a rainy winter in the Pacific Northwest, the crew turned their faces back to the east. Upon their safe arrival in St. Louis that September, the two captains were hailed as heroes, living embodiments of rugged self-reliance. Sacagawea's husband, Charbonneau, was paid $500 for services mostly rendered by his wife, who received nothing. The Frenchman took up farming near St. Louis at the invitation of the new U.S. agent for Indian Affairs, William Clark. But unfortunately, the former trapper was no more a farmer than he was a swimmer, and soon the two were back in the wild. During the autumn of 1812, in a primitive trading post in what is now South Dakota, Sacagawea became ill with fever. She began to speak of a desire to return to her own people, the Shoshone, and see what remained of her family, but she never had the chance. On December 20th, she died, only 25 years old. William Clark adopted Jean-Baptiste as his own son, along with his little sister Lizette. Overlooked and forgotten in her own time, Sacagawea's memory was revived a century later by the suffragette movement. The story of the crucial role she played in Lewis and Clark's expedition, including voting on at least one important decision along with the men, was now retold in biographies and pamphlets, and statues went up in western cities her feet had softly stepped through 100 years earlier when the lands were wild. Her tale is bittersweet, jam-packed in such a short time with more victories and more tragedies than most experience in a full life. She was a remarkable woman, achieving much despite undergoing sorrows and hardships that really few can imagine today, while ultimately earning the affection and even admiration of the white men. In her own time, Sacagawea was never truly afforded the respect and recognition she deserved, and her brief, heartfelt reunion with her family was scandalously short. We can't fix that, but what we can do is honor her memory, keep her story alive in the hearts of each new generation of Americans, and resolve to learn from her courageous example. If you want more stories of fierce and wildly courageous women from history, check out these videos. Please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and let us know in the comments what you think of the channel so far. Remember, you can do hard things. Be brave, be strong.